In the summer of 1987, a woman named Yasmin Laban received a box. It had been sent from a storage facility in Los Angeles, where the belongings of her mother had been held since the previous May. Since the morning that the housekeeper had called and the ambulance had come, and the reporters had gathered outside the house on Roxbury Drive, and the news had gone out across America that the woman the world knew as Rita Hayworth was gone. The box contained, among other things, a small cassette tape. Nobody had labeled it. Nobody had written a date on it, or a title, or any indication of when it had been made or what was on it. It was simply there, in a cardboard box, among the photographs and the letters and the small objects that accumulate in a life, and that the people left behind must sort through in the weeks after a death, deciding what to keep and what to release, and what to simply hold in their hands for a while without deciding anything at all. Yasmin put the tape into a player, and her mother's voice came out. Not the voice of the final years, the voice that the disease had reduced to something fragmented and confused, the voice of a woman who had spent the last decade of her life being slowly taken apart by an illness that nobody yet had a proper name for. The voice on the tape was clear. It was the voice of a woman who knew exactly what she was saying and had chosen, in some private moment that nobody else was present for, to say it. What she said on that tape, my friend, is what we are here tonight to talk about. Because Rita Hayworth, who was the most photographed woman in the world in 1947, who was pinned to the atomic bomb that was dropped on Bikini Atoll, who was called the love goddess by a press that understood her body and her face and absolutely nothing else about her, Rita Hayworth spent the last coherent years of her life making a record of the things she had never said publicly. And the tape that her daughter found in a storage box in Los Angeles in the summer of 1987 was the most important piece of that record. Tonight, I want to tell you the whole story, not the story of the films, though the films were extraordinary. Not the story of the marriages, though the marriages were disasters of a specific and instructive kind. The real story, the story of what was happening inside the woman that the camera captured so completely, it had no idea what it was missing, so sit with me. Get comfortable. We are going back to Brooklyn, New York, in the year 1918, to a family of Spanish dancers called the Cansinos, who had come to America from Seville and who were, in every way that the word can be used, a performing family, which is to say, a family in which the line between private life and professional life had never been clearly drawn, and in which the children understood from their first conscious moments that their bodies and their talents were resources that belonged, in some fundamental sense, to something larger than themselves. Her name was not Rita Hayworth. Her name was Margarita Carmen Cansino, and she was born on the 17th of October, 1918, the eldest child of Eduardo Cansino Sr. and Volga Hayworth Cansino. Eduardo was a Spanish dancer of considerable reputation who had performed across Europe before coming to America. Volga was an American woman, Irish and English in her ancestry, who had been a Ziegfeld Follies showgirl before her marriage. The combination of those two people and those two traditions produced, in Margarita, a child who was dark-haired and dark-eyed in the Spanish manner, with a quality of physical grace that was visible before she was old enough to understand what it meant or what it was going to be used for. She began dancing seriously at the age of 6, not because she asked to, because Eduardo decided she would. Eduardo Cansino was a man of enormous charm and enormous appetites and enormous certainty about what the people around him owed him, including his daughter. He had recognized in Margarita what any skilled dancer would have recognized: a body that moved with natural musicality, a face that the camera would eventually confirm was something extraordinary, and an obedience that had been trained into her from infancy by a father who did not distinguish clearly between his professional life and the lives of the people who depended on him. By the time she was 12, she was performing professionally with her father as part of the Dancing Cansinos. By the time she was 14, Eduardo had pulled her out of school entirely to focus on the act. They performed in Mexican casinos, on nightclub circuits, in whatever venues would take a Spanish dancer and his unusually beautiful teenage daughter. What happened during those years between Eduardo and Margarita is something that Margarita herself did not speak about publicly until very late in her life, and that the people closest to her only understood fully in retrospect after the tape was found and the full shape of what she had recorded on it became known within the family. What she said on that tape about her father, about those years, about what the act required of her, and what Eduardo required of her beyond the act, was the secret that she had carried longer than any other secret in a life that was not short of them. She was discovered by a Fox film talent scout in 1935 while performing with her father at a Tijuana casino. She was 16 years old. She was signed almost immediately, renamed Rita Cancino for her first films, and placed in a series of small roles that traded almost entirely on her appearance and her dancing ability and asked very little of anything else. The films were not distinguished. She was. Something in the way she moved and the way the camera found her face suggested to everyone who saw the footage that they were looking at something that the industry did not encounter very often. Not beauty alone, which Hollywood had in excess, but beauty combined with a quality of interior presence of a person who was actually there behind the eyes, that made the camera want to stay. Fox let her contract lapse in 1937. She was 18, and she had made 11 films, and she had not yet become famous. And the studio decided that the investment was not paying off quickly enough. She was let go. She met Edward Judson that year. He was 40 years old to her 18. He was a car salesman by original trade who had developed over the years an instinct for identifying valuable things that other people had not yet recognized as valuable and positioning himself to profit from them. He saw Margarita Cancino, and he saw, with the clarity of a man who has spent his life appraising things, exactly what she was worth and exactly what needed to be done to convert that worth into money. He married her, and then he set about remaking her. The dark hair was dyed red, a specific, extraordinary shade of auburn red that would become one of the most recognized colors in Hollywood history. The hairline was raised by electrolysis, a painful process that she underwent repeatedly over several months, to give her face the particular proportions that the studio cameras of the era favored. The name was changed, Rita Hayworth, taking the anglicized form of her mother's maiden name. The Spanish heritage was not eliminated but was redirected. She was no longer a Mexican casino dancer's daughter from Brooklyn. She was a glamorous creature of indeterminate and vaguely European origin, which was what the studios wanted and what the audiences of the late 1930s were prepared to receive. She signed with Columbia Pictures in 1937. Harry Cohn, who ran Columbia with the absolute authority of a man who believed that authority was indistinguishable from ownership, looked at Rita Hayworth and saw exactly what Judson had seen, and then some. He signed her to a long-term contract and began putting her in films with increasing regularity, increasing quality of production, and increasing prominence of placement. The films she made between 1939 and 1941, Only Angels Have Wings, The Strawberry Blonde, Blood and Sand, established her as a star in the specific way that the studio system of that era established stars. Through the accumulation of roles that were carefully calibrated to develop an image, to train the audience in what to expect from this face, to build the particular relationship between a performer and the public that is called stardom. And that is as much about repetition and familiarity as it is about any single performance. She was working. She was famous. She was married to a man who had remade her in the image of what the industry wanted, and who was managing her career with the skills of a professional appraiser who knows what a thing is worth but does not particularly love the thing. Judson was controlling in ways that went beyond professional management. He monitored her movements. He chose her clothes, her friends, her schedule. He was not physically violent in the way of her later husband, but he was a man who had invested in a property and intended to protect that investment by controlling everything that could affect its value, including the woman herself. She left him in 1942. She had been with him for 5 years. She was 23 years old, and she had been managed by controlling men since before she was old enough to understand what management was, and she was beginning, slowly and at considerable personal cost, to understand what had been done to her and what it was going to take to be free of it. She was not free of it yet. The year 1941 had produced the photograph, a single photograph, taken for Life magazine by Bob Landry, of Rita Hayworth kneeling on a bed in a white and black lace negligee, looking over her shoulder at the camera with an expression that contained everything the country needed in that moment. Desire and distance, and a quality of self-possession that suggested the desire would be satisfied only on terms she approved. The photograph was reproduced millions of times. It was the most requested pinup of the Second World War. It was taped to the walls of barracks from the Pacific to North Africa. It was carried in wallets and written about in letters home. It was, for the duration of the war, the face that American men carried with them into the worst years of their lives, as proof that there was something on the other side of the worst years worth returning to. She was 22 years old when the photograph was taken. She had been a professional performer since she was 12. She had been managed and remade and positioned and controlled by a series of men who understood her value and claimed portions of it as their own. And now her image, a specific version of her constructed by an industry and a photographer and the particular hungers of a country at war, had been multiplied into millions of copies and distributed across the world. And she had no more control over what happened to those copies than she had over anything else in the life that had been built around her. The atomic bomb test at Bikini Atoll in July 1946 was the moment that, if you look at it clearly, tells you everything about what the world had made of Rita Hayworth. The bomb was called Gilda after her film of that year. Her image was painted on the casing. The men who painted it thought they were paying a tribute. What they were actually doing was using a woman's face and name to decorate a weapon of mass destruction. And the men in charge of the test had approved it, and the press had reported it as a kind of charming detail. And Rita Hayworth, when she heard about it, was reportedly furious in a way she was not able to express publicly without the consequences of expressing it. She was not consulted. She was not asked. Her image had become public property in a way that permitted this use without her knowledge or consent. And the men who made the decision did not regard her objection as something that needed to be taken into account. She had married Orson Welles in 1943. This is the marriage that everyone writes about when they write about Rita Hayworth, because Orson Welles was Orson Welles, the most celebrated director of his generation, already famous for Citizen Kane, already the embodiment of a particular vision of what American genius looked like, large and brilliant and impossible in the specific way of men whose talent is real and whose self-regard is realer. The marriage was, in its first years, genuinely loving. She was not a woman who was easy to love well, by her own later admission, not because of any coldness in her, but because of what the years with Eduardo and then Judson had done to her capacity to receive love without anticipating the cost of it. She had been loved by men who saw her value and extracted it. The expectation that Welles would eventually do the same was built into her before she was conscious of having built it. Welles did not manage her or control her in the way of his predecessors. His particular form of damage was different. He was absent. He was always working on something, always consumed by the next project, always present in the marriage as a force of personality and intermittently absent as an actual partner. She had a daughter with him, Rebecca, born in 1944. She raised Rebecca largely alone while Welles worked. They divorced in 1947. She had been with him for 4 years. She had a daughter and a career that was at its commercial peak, and a private life that had been conducted almost entirely in the service of other people's needs and other people's visions of who she should be. And then she met Ali Khan. Prince Ali Khan was the son of the Aga Khan III, spiritual leader of the Ismaili Muslims, an enormously wealthy man of extraordinary charm who moved through the international social world of the late 1940s with the ease of someone for whom the world had been arranged, since birth, for precisely this purpose. He pursued Rita Hayworth with a directness and a lavishness that was, she later said, unlike anything she had encountered. He sent flowers. He arranged dinners. He flew from one country to another to be in the same room with her. He was, by the account of everyone who observed them together in those early years, genuinely besotted. She married him in May 1949 at his villa in France. The wedding was covered by press from around the world. The photographs of Rita Hayworth in a pale blue gown at her French wedding were published in newspapers from New York to Tokyo. She was 30 years old. She had remade herself from Margarita Cancino into Rita Hayworth once already, and now she remade herself again into a princess, a title she held in the sense that it attached to her by marriage, but that never quite fit in the sense of a life lived in alignment with its meaning. She had a daughter with Ali Khan, Yasmin, born in December 1949. The same Yasmin who, 38 years later, would find the tape in the storage box and hear her mother's voice speaking clearly about the things that had been kept quiet for a lifetime. The marriage to Ali Khan lasted until 1953. He was not faithful. He had never claimed to be a man who intended fidelity, and the world of international society in which he moved had its own understanding of what marriage meant for a man of his wealth and position, an understanding that did not include the exclusive attachment that Rita Hayworth, despite the received wisdom about her, actually wanted. She wanted a home. She wanted stability. She wanted the specific ordinary life that her extraordinary face had made impossible. A life in which she was known as a person and not as an image, in which she was loved for what she was and not for what she represented to the person doing the loving. She did not find it with Ali Khan. She did not find it in the 2 marriages that followed, a brief and unhappy union with the singer Dick Haymes, which lasted from 1953 to 1955 and was marked by financial disasters and Haynes's alcoholism, and then a final marriage to the film producer James Hill from 1958 to 1961, which produced no children and ended in the specific kind of quiet defeat that follows when 2 people who might have been right for each other under different circumstances discover that the circumstances have become the whole problem. She made films through all of it. Pal Joey in 1957 with Frank Sinatra and Kim Novak, Separate Tables in 1958. They were careful professional films. She was careful and professional in them. But something had begun to change in her work in those years that the people who looked closely at it could see without quite being able to name. There were days when she forgot lines that she knew perfectly well. There were moments when the continuity of a scene would slip away from her, and she would find herself, in the middle of a take, uncertain where she was in the material. There were mornings on set when the woman who arrived was not quite the woman who had been there the day before. Slightly different in her responses, slightly different in her recall, in a way that her directors noted and her co-stars noticed, and that everyone on the production attributed to a variety of causes, none of which were the true cause, because the true cause did not yet have a name that anyone would have thought to apply to a woman in her early 40s. She was 50 years old in 1968. The films had slowed. The offers were not what they had been. The industry moves in a direction that is unkind to women at 50 in a way that it is not unkind to men at 50. And Rita Hayworth, who had given the industry the most famous pin-up photograph of the 20th century, was experiencing the specific form of abandonment that the industry reserves for the women it has used up. She moved through the 1970s in a way that the people who loved her found frightening, and that the press, when it found her, found either tragic or sensational depending on the publication. She would appear at events and be somehow not quite present. She would give interviews in which she would lose the thread of what she was saying in a way that suggested not distraction, but something more fundamental, a dissolution of the continuity of self that most people take entirely for granted. The doctors, when they finally assembled the full picture, called it Alzheimer's disease. But this was 1980, and Alzheimer's was not yet the widely understood diagnosis it would later become, and the long years before the diagnosis in which her behavior had been described as alcoholism, because the symptoms overlapped, because she did drink, because it was easier for everyone involved to name a problem they recognized than to confront one they didn't. Those years had done their own damage to how she was seen and how she saw herself. Her daughter Yasmin took over her care in 1977, when it became clear that Rita could no longer manage the practical requirements of her own life. Yasmin was 27 years old. She moved her mother from apartment to apartment in New York, and eventually to a building on West 57th Street, where she could be monitored and cared for, and where she lived out the last decade of her life in the company of a disease that took things from her one by one in a sequence that had its own terrible logic. The recent memories going first, then the older ones, then the language, then the body, until what remained was a woman who needed to be fed and bathed and dressed, and who no longer knew on most days what her name had been. She died on the 14th of May, 1987. She was 68 years old. And in the summer after her death, in a cardboard box from a storage facility in Los Angeles, Yasmin found the tape. What was on the tape, Yasmin has spoken about in careful terms over the years, in interviews that she has given as an advocate for Alzheimer's awareness, a cause she took up after her mother's death and has pursued with the seriousness of a person who understands from the inside what the disease does to a family. She has been protective of the specific content, as she has every right to be. But the outline of what her mother recorded in the years before the disease took her language away entirely is known. Rita Hayworth recorded her account of what happened during the years with Eduardo Cancino. She recorded her understanding, arrived at over decades of reflection, of what those years had done to her capacity for trust, to her understanding of what she was worth to other people, and what that worth cost her, to the patterns that had repeated themselves in the marriages and the professional relationships and the long struggle to be seen as a person rather than an image. She recorded in the voice of a woman who knew she was losing language and was determined to put certain things into the record before the language was entirely gone. The story that she had never told publicly in 50 years of being one of the most publicly scrutinized women in the world. She recorded it for Yasmin, not for publication, not for the press, not for the fans who had written the letters and bought the tickets and pinned the photographs to the walls of the barracks. For her daughter. The daughter she had named after the Islamic concept of jasmine, fragrant and delicate and harder to destroy than it looks. The tape exists. The full content of it remains, appropriately, with Yasmin, who has said enough about it over the years to allow the shape of it to be understood without violating the privacy that her mother was entitled to and that her daughter has honored. What the tape tells us, what the shape of it tells us, even without the specific words, is something that everyone who has looked carefully at Rita Hayworth's life has understood in pieces and never quite been able to assemble whole. It tells us that the woman in the photograph, the woman on the pinup, the woman called Gilda and the love goddess and every other name that the century attached to her, was someone entirely different from all of those names. It tells us that she knew this, that she had always known it with a clarity that the image made invisible. It tells us that she lived with the knowledge of the gap between who she was and what the world saw for 50 years, and that the recording she made in the last coherent years of her life was an attempt to close that gap before the disease closed it for her. She had been Margarita Cancino before she was Rita Hayworth. She had been a daughter before she was an image. She had been a woman who wanted ordinary things, love and stability and a home and the specific, unglamorous privacy of a life that belongs to the person living it, before she was the most photographed woman in the world. And the tape she left behind was her way of saying, I was that person. I was her the whole time. Whatever you saw, whatever you thought you saw, whatever you pinned to the walls and painted on the bombs and multiplied into millions of copies, that was not me. That was what you made of me. I was something else entirely. And now, my friend, I want to sit with you for a moment in the quiet that comes after a story like this one, because I think there is something here that is worth sitting with. We spend a great deal of time as a culture looking at the faces of famous people and believing that what we see is what is there. We look at a photograph and we believe that the expression in it is the full expression of the person. We look at a film and we believe that the woman on the screen has chosen, freely and completely, to be exactly what she appears to be. We confuse the image with the person, and we build entire industries on that confusion. And we are usually not even aware that we are doing it. Rita Hayworth's life is what happens when the confusion is total and sustained over decades. It is what happens when an entire civilization decides that a woman is an image and organizes itself around that decision, with the photographs and the pinups and the bomb casings and the marketing campaigns, without ever pausing to ask what the person behind the image might have wanted to be instead. She wanted to be Margarita. That is what the tape says, in whatever words it says it. She wanted to have been allowed to be the person she was born as, to live the life she was born into, with the parents she had, made possible, and impossible from the very beginning. She wanted in the end what most people want, to be known. Not famous, known. She left that tape. She made it before the language left her, in the years when she understood what was coming and was determined to leave something behind that was genuinely her, that could not be altered or distributed or renamed or painted on a bomb. A tape in a cardboard box in a storage facility in Los Angeles waiting for her daughter. Yasmin found it. Yasmin heard her mother's voice, clear and present, speaking the things that 50 years of being Rita Hayworth had made impossible to say out loud. She heard it, and her mother, finally, was known. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see her face, in a film clip, in one of the photographs that are still reproduced everywhere, in the pinup that is still the most famous image of its kind, look at the person behind it. She was there the whole time. She just couldn't tell you.